Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. We are up to chapter 15 of the laws of Tumas Meis. It is Thursday. Let us begin with a brief recap of where we are up to in the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. Has 14 volumes. We are in volume number 10, which has a total of 144 chapters and 8 subjects. Let's take a look. The 8 subjects are Tumas Meis, impurity of the dead. As I said, we're up to chapter 15, so we're more than halfway through that. Then we'll speak about the red heifer, about Sora'as, Mishkav Moishav, another form of impurity, other forms of impurity, impurity with relating to foods, to vessels, and finally the laws of mikvahs. But today, we are up to chapter 15. Let's just see a little. This is all from the Rambam, but the next page is not from the Rambam. It's just a breakdown because we're spending about 3.5 weeks on this topic. So it's just interesting to see the progression. The first 5 days, we spoke about the sources and recipients of Tumas Meis, impurity of the dead. The next 5 days, we spoke about the grave, and we spoke about the land of the nations, and over the last week, we have been speaking about Ohel, which is, in one instances, a dead person or dead body would impart impurity by being under the same roof as the person. So that's what we're studying about at the moment. And finally, today we'll be speaking about a way that this canopy, or the way that we could prevent the tumah from coming in. That's today's topic. And the next discussion will be, in the days to come, next week, of the way items can be prevented from... today we're speaking about how the room can be closed off so the tumah doesn't come in. And the next discussion will be how you can actually seal an item in the tamei room so that it doesn't contract the impurity. Let's take a look at today's chapter 15, a very short chapter. It's only got 5 halachas. Let's learn them inside. The following laws apply when a functional window was closed entirely or closed to the extent that less than a handbreadth by a handbreadth, that's what did we say that is? I think about 8 centimeters. So it's closed to the extent that there's less than 8 square centimeters remaining. If it was closed with an entity, I shouldn't say 8 square centimeters, I should say an area about 8 or 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters, a round hole. So if there's less than that amount of space remaining, then the impurity won't go through. Okay, so if you've got 2 rooms in a building, and the tumah is in the one room, and you're in the second room, will the tumah go from one room to the next? Now, if there's a roof over the building, then it could be that the roof brings it over. But let's say you just have 2 rooms, maybe flat roof, one side by side, and then there's a window between these 2 rooms. So will the tumah extend itself, spread from the one room to the next, or won't it spread from the one room to the next? So we're saying that if the window between the 2 rooms is closed, then it will stop the tumah from coming from room A to room B. It will stop the spread of the virus or of the tumah. But if there's an opening between the 2 rooms, then the tumah will spread. So if there is only a small opening, that's fine. But if there's a larger opening, but it was closed, so the question is, how are you closing that opening? So he says like this, 2 primary points. If it was closed with an entity that intervenes in the face of ritual impurity, it is considered as closed, provided it is an entity that the owner does not intend to move. So it needs to be two criteria. Even if right now your window is blocked, if the item that's blocking the window is something that's not there to stay forever, then it's considered like it's not there, and then the impurity will still spread from one room to the next. Or even if it is there to stay, if the substance that's in the window is a substance that itself contracts impurity, then again, the impurity will spread. I guess kind of imagine it like you were waterproofing, right? If you wanted to prevent water from spreading from one room to the next. But your waterproofing, you can't have temporary water. You can't have some waterproofing won't generally work with an item that's just there temporarily. It needs to be sealed. And the material that you're using to seal needs to be material that is actually waterproof. So imagine the tumah to be water that's in the one room, and you don't want it to spill over to spread to the other room. So you want to close up the window in between. So the two conditions to closing up that window are that number one, whatever's in that window is there to stay. And number two, it's not something that itself can contract impurity. And that's the principle of the whole chapter. And based on that, we're going to go through lots of different scenarios before we get there. Therefore, if you close the window or reduce its size with foods that were not made susceptible to contract ritual impurity, we said earlier that a food can only receive impurity once it has been become wet. If it never become wet and it never becomes susceptible to ritual impurity, then even though they won't become susceptible to ritual impurity, so it would be like the equivalent of putting up a board that is waterproof, it would not intervene because it's not there to stay. It's not permanent. Even though they are not susceptible to ritual impurity and they are pure, his intent is to move them. So if you put fruit to that window to close it up, although the fruit may have not yet become susceptible to ritual impurity, they do not act as a barrier, and the tumah will spread because they're there temporarily. They're not there forever. But if the fruits that he put onto that windowsill were rotting, then they do intervene. I don't know how things worked back then. Today, if something's rotten, then you want to get rid of it as fast as you can. It sounds like back then, if it was rotting, it was no longer edible. And once it's not edible, then that could be it. It could stay there. It could rot there. It could stay there forever. So then if it's there forever, then it will act as a barrier to prevent the tumah from spreading, from flooding from one room into the next. Similarly, straw that is rotting intervenes because it's rotting. If it's not rotting, it does not intervene because we assume that the owner intends to move it. He's going to use it. What about grain? If grain grew from the floor, from the ground, and blocked the window or reduced its size, it does not intervene. Why? Because the owner is going to remove it. Why? Because if he doesn't, then it's going to grow into the wall. It's going to damage the wall. But if its roots were distant from the wall and just the heads of the stalks grew on an incline and blocked the window, then it does intervene because then he doesn't have a need to move it. I don't know why here we're not concerned that he'll decide to use it. Not sure why. Maybe because it's still connected to the ground. I'm not sure. But similar laws apply in all the analogous situations. So we have our two principles. It needs to be there to stay, and it needs to be an item that's not susceptible to ritual impurity. Let's look at more scenarios. What happens if a barrel filled with rotting dried figs, which were never made susceptible to ritual impurity and enough for it to be eaten? So you have a barrel filled with items, with food. So if the food itself was placed on the window, it would block. But the food wasn't placed by itself. It was placed in a barrel. And the opening of the barrel is towards the source of impurity. So the barrel will become impure because imagine the impurity will spread straight into the barrel. The barrel itself is impure. In such a situation, similarly, if a container is filled with rotten straw that is not meant to be used as animal fodder, for mortar, for building, or for kindling, that was... Sorry?
Metropolitan Insurance.
Sorry, 1 second. So we are discussing a scenario where the actual fruits would act as a barrier because they're rotten and they're not susceptible to ritual impurity, but they're in a barrel. And the barrel can contract ritual impurity. And the barrel is facing the impurity. So the barrel becomes impure. Well, the same would be if it's a container filled with rotten straw, and the straw is not fit to be used as edible fodder, or for water, for building, or for kindling. That was placed in the window. So if the figs or the straw would be able to remain standing independently were their container to be removed, then they would be considered as intervening. If not, they do not intervene. So basically, if the intervening substances were placed in a barrel or in a box, so we pretend as if we look what would have happened if the barrel or box was not there. If had the barrel not been there, the fruits would have fallen off. They wouldn't have stayed in place. So that it means what's really holding the fort is an item which is susceptible to ritual impurity, and therefore the tumah will spread. Impurity will spread. If the items in the barrel or the box, if you were to remove the barrel or box, would be able to stay put in place without the barrel or box, so then we consider it as if the barrel or box is non-existent because they would manage without it, and then the items in the barrel or box will be able to intervene. They'll be able to stop the tumah from spreading. The following entities all reduce the size of a window. So here we have lots of examples. Bitter grasses that are not fit for animal fodder. All of these examples are examples of that are discussed in the Mishnah, if I'm not mistaken. So bitter grasses that are not fit for animal fodder, patches that are not 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, that are filthy and firm, so that they are not fit to clean blood off a scratch. So we're talking here about cloth, but the cloth needs to be so small and so dirty that it wouldn't be used for anything. That way it can't contract ritual impurity. Or a limb or flesh that was hanging limply from an impure animal, provided the animal was lean and unfit to be sold to a Gentile and tethered so that it will not flee. So this is a very strange scenario where there's like a limb or flesh that's hanging from the animal, and that is now the animal still alive, so it's not considered impure, and it's hanging, it's there in the window and it's blocking it, so that will block because it has no function and it doesn't contract ritual impurity and it's there to stay. A non-kosher bird resting in a window, provided it is one which scratches, so that it wouldn't be used, a child wouldn't play with it. Because if a child would play with it, then it means it wouldn't stay there. If it wouldn't stay there, it's not there to stay, then it won't block. A non-Jew who's been tied up because he's one of the prisoners of the king, whom another person may not release. He's there, he's stuck right now. It's torturous and it's terrible, but we're asking as a matter of fact whether he prevents the impurity from spreading. And we're saying that he does. An infant born after an 8-month pregnancy on the Shabbos, because it is forbidden to move it. This is a whole separate discussion. In Talmudic times, a baby that was born in the 7th month would survive, and one born in the 9th month would survive, but a one born in the 8th month would have no way to be able to live. Or salt that was mixed with thorns, that is not fit to be used for food nor for leatherworking, provided it is placed on a shard so that it will not damage the wall. Again, these are all materials that have no use. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, thank you. The rationale is that these substances are not susceptible to ritual impurity, nor does the owner intend to move them because they are not fit for work. Similarly, when a Torah scroll was worn out and placed in a window. Still. Okay. So if a Torah scroll was worn out, meaning it was no longer kosher, and it was placed in that window, so if he decided that that's where the Torah will be buried, because a non-kosher Torah has to be buried, then it's there to stay. And so it will be able to reduce the size of the window. As opposed to if the person decides that he's going to bury it properly under the ground, then it means it's not there to stay, so it would not act as a barrier. Snow, hail, sleet, ice, and water would not reduce the size of a window because they are susceptible to ritual impurity. Okay, so here's an interesting scenario where you have an item that itself can be a cause of tumah, in itself is infectious, except it's not infectious because it's less than the volume. So we're talking now, when I say it's infectious, I mean spiritually, the item itself causes tumah, it causes impurity, but only once it's of a certain size. What if that very item was placed in the window? Will it act as a barrier since it is less than the minimal amount that is required for it to be able to spread? And the answer is yes. Even though it itself, had it been in higher volumes, would have been a source of impurity, since it is lower than the certain volume that it is required to be to spread impurity, it can act as a barrier. So he gives us some examples of that. If I reduce the size of the bread, a handbreadth with less than an olive-sized portion of flesh of a corpse, or less than an olive-sized portion of the meat of a dead animal, or a portion of bone from a corpse that is less than the size of a barley corn, which is absolutely tiny, or a portion less than a lentil from a crawling animal, which again is absolutely tiny, these substances intervene in the presence of ritual impurity. The rationale is that they are all pure, and since they are not important to the owner, he does not intend to move them. So they're pure. If they were a little bigger, then they would be making impure. But since they're so small, they're actually neutralized, they become pure, and he plans on leaving them there so they can act as a barrier. Similarly, less than an excised portion of food that was not made susceptible to ritual impurity is not important. So although simply because it's so small, it means he's going to leave it there. And hence, all of the above reduce the measure of the handbreadth. All of the above do act as a barrier to prevent the tumah from spreading. Halacha number 4, back to the barrel or box. If I close the window with an earthenware vessel, so now it's an empty barrel, an empty earthenware barrel, and the opening faced the outside, meaning it faced away from the source of impurity. So then it intervenes. Why? Because if you may remember that an earthenware vessel can only contract impurity from the inside. So since it's got its back, since it's turned away from the window, so it acts as a barrier. But it needs to be disgusting and full of holes so that the person doesn't intend on using it, not even for bloodletting. Because if he planned on using it, then it means he's going to move it. And if he's going to move it, then it does not serve as a barrier. Final halacha number 5. The following laws apply if there was a corpse. So here's an interesting scenario. This could have done with the diagram. You have, maybe we'll do one quickly since we're running ahead of time. So here's our house. And here is, okay. And here we have a window. Okay. Small little window. And we try to ensure that it's small enough that the impurity doesn't leave. Okay. So here is the impurity. Let's just put in this little house is a source of impurity, which we will just go like this. Here's our impurity. Okay. Now inside the window, we have something. What's inside the window? So until now we said that if this inside the window, if this little item in the window, for example, was a piece of flesh that was less than the minimal size, was less than a kazayas, then it serves, it blocks the impurity from going out. Why? Because it's less than the minimal size. But here in halacha number 5, we say that if the impurity in the window was of the same substance as the impurity in the house, so then it's going to join up, and then it will not be able to serve as a barrier. So we said if this impurity is less than a kazayas of flesh, then it acts as a barrier because it's less than the mutable size. But if this was also flesh, whatever was in the house, so then it will join up. It will be as if it's attached to the larger mass, and the total amount will be more than a kazayas, and then it will be a source of impurity, and it will not be able to prevent the tumah from going out the window. Did you get that? Let's see that inside the text. So if there was a corpse or a fourth of a cup of bones or the like from bones that impart impurity through oil, through a canopy in a house, and the owner sought to reduce the size of the window of this house with a bone that is less than a barley corn, its size is not reduced because the size of the window, because the bone in the window is considered as part of the bones in the room that generate impurity. Similarly, if a corpse or an unsized portion from the flesh of a corpse was in a home, and the owner sought to reduce the size of the window with a portion of flesh from a corpse, its size is not reduced, the size of the window. Why? Because the flesh is combined with the other flesh. Nevertheless, a bone that is less than the size of a barley corn reduces the size of a window, and thus prevents the spread of impurity brought about by an unsized portion of flesh, and less than an unsized portion of flesh reduces the size of a window, and thus prevents the spread of impurity brought about by a fourth of a cup of bones or the like. So going back to the diagram, this that we say that, where are we, whiteboard? This that we say that if the room had impurity, then the window had impurity which was small, that they combine as if it's there at the same time. So if there was bones in the room and the impurity in the window was half a bone, less than the minimal size, then it joins up and it does not act as a barrier. Or if there was flesh, a body in the room, and then there was flesh in the window, it would join up. But if there was flesh in the room, in the window, less than the size, minimal size, and bones in the room, or flesh in the room and bones in the window, then they will not join up, and therefore this little item in the window will be able to serve as an intervening substance and prevent the tumah from leaving the room. If one sought to reduce the size of a handbreadth with the woof and the warp of a cloth that is afflicted with saras, or with a clod of earth from a base of pras, so its size is not reduced because these actual items are in their own right impure. Earth from a base of pras, which is a field where a grave was plowed over, or a garment of saras, even though it's tiny, are in their own right impure. They will not act as an intervening substance. If one made a brick from the earth of a base of pras, then it becomes pure and can reduce the size of a window. Because just that the rabbi said that the earth of a field in which a grave was plowed over is impure, is only the earth in its original state. Once it's turned into a brick, then it is pure. It is no longer impure. And now back to the WhatsApp that went out. Sorry, you had to wait till the end. The following rules apply if the handbreadth was closed or reduced in size by a spider web. If its strands were substantial, it is considered as an intervening substance, and if not, it does not intervene. So the answer is yes, even a spider web has the ability to prevent the spread of the virus, to prevent tumah from spreading from one room to the next. Let us test your knowledge.
Exactly what you're talking about. Don't worry about that. And it's quite a warm day today.
One moment, please.
Very hot.
Question number one. If one closed the hole in a window, but something temporarily, Rachi, over the side da, the dark side still. If one closed the hole in the window with something temporarily until he fixed it, does it block tumah from entering from the next room? Yes or no?
No.
Correct. It's temporary. If a plant grew next to a window and its leaves block the opening, does impurity pass through it? Yes, plants do not block impurity, or no, as long as there is no empty space of a handbreadth, or yes, unless the plant grew some distance from the wall and its leaves were angled to block the window. 1, 2, or
So
3?
number 3.
Correct. Because we said if it's going to damage the wall, then the owner is going to remove it. And then it means it's not there to stay. Does snow placed in the space of a window block Tuma from entering or leaving through it? No, because it will eventually melt. No, because it is susceptible to impurity. Or yes, it does block it. Correct. Number 2, it is one of the 8 liquids that are susceptible to impurity and make things actually susceptible to impurity. What is the status of a brick made from the earth of a base of crust of a field whose had a grave in it that was plowed over? It is pure and may be used to block impurity from entering through a window, or it is impure and may not be used to block impurity from entering through a window.
Number 1.
Correct. If it's no longer, well done. We got 4 out of 4. Thank you so much for joining. Wish